Okay, we're going to talk about sentence structure and sentence variety. And before we do that, we need to learn about clauses. So clauses are a part of a sentence that include both the subject and verb. Types of clauses are independent and dependent. So independent clauses can stand alone as its own sentence. It makes sense. It has a subject and a verb, and it's a complete thought. A dependent clause depends on an independent clause to make it a complete sentence. So you can think of it as a table with 4 legs that can stand on its own. That is an independent clause, and a dependent clause cannot stand on its own. The first type of clause that we're going to talk about is a subordinate clause. It starts with a subordinating conjunction, like we talked about in class today. Examples of subordinating conjunctions that begin a subordinate clause are whenever, as, because, since, while, until. All of these are subordinating conjunctions that begin a subordinate clause. The next type of clause is a relative clause. A relative clause starts with a relative pronoun or adjective, such as who, whom, whose, that, when, where, and why. And I think this is just an extra box. So I meant to give you some examples of subordinate clauses, and then I skipped that. So an example of a subordinate clause. Subordinate clause is a dependent clause. It cannot stand on its own. So an example would be, because she stayed on the phone too long the night before. What happened because she stayed on the phone too long the night before? Sarah did poorly on her test the next day. Make sure you can see all that. Okay, so because she stayed on the phone too long the night before, Sarah did poorly on her test the next day. If you begin with a subordinate clause, you have to put a comma at the end of the subordinate clause. So it would look like this. You can also switch these around. Begin with the independent clause and then end the sentence with the subordinate clause. You do not need a comma between an independent clause here and a subordinate clause here. Only if you begin with a subordinate clause. Another example is, don't try talking to Miss Roundtree until she has her first cup of coffee. There, now you can see all of it. Okay, don't try talking to Miss Roundtree until she has her first cup of coffee. You'd start with the capital letter, obviously. You do not need a comma here because we're not starting with a subordinate clause. If we began with a subordinate clause, we would need a comma here. So until she has her first cup of coffee, comma, don't try talking to Miss Roundtree. This cannot stand on its own until she has her first cup of coffee. Until she has her first cup of coffee, what? That's not a complete thought. It is a dependent clause. Okay, now on to relative clauses. So they start with a relative pronoun, such as one of these. An example would be, Nick gave some chips to Bob, who forgot to bring his lunch. So Nick gave some chips to Bob is an independent clause. Nick is the subject, gave is the verb, it's a complete thought. Who forgot to bring his lunch is a dependent clause. It cannot stand alone. With relative clauses, we have non-essential and essential clauses. A non-essential relative clause is when the thing or person that the relative clause is referring to is specific. then this is just extra information that explains something about this person, but it's not essential to us knowing who this person or thing is. So this example, Nick gave some chips to Bob. If we knew Bob, we would already know who Bob was. This is just extra information, so we would need a comma here. So Nick gave some chips to Bob, comma, who forgot to bring his lunch. However, if we had a general noun, such as the dog, we don't know which dog, Nick gave some chips to the dog, that was sniffing around the table. So maybe there are 7 dogs and there is only one that's sniffing around the table. This is an essential relative clause because it's telling us specific information about which dog this is. When we have an essential relative clause, we do not need a comma. Okay, next type of dependent clause is a noun clause. A noun clause functions as a noun. Imagine that. So normally we have something like, I like baseball. Baseball is a noun. In a noun clause, we have a clause that's functioning as a noun. So I like what I see. This right here is functioning as a noun. It is a something. Just like we have I like baseball, this is a noun. It is a something. This is a noun clause. And our last type of dependent clause is an adverbial clause. It functions as an adverb. And just like all adverbs, it answers the questions when, where, why, and how. Okay, so our example is, Josephine's cats bolted from the driveway once they saw her car turn the corner. So Josephine's cats bolted from the driveway is an independent clause that can stand by itself and still make sense. We add this adverbial clause, once they saw her car turn the corner, and this is telling us when. So when do they bolt from the driveway? Once they saw her car turn the corner. Okay, now that we have clauses, we're going to talk about putting those clauses together to make different types of sentences. So the first type of sentence is a simple sentence, and that is just an independent clause by itself. Independent clause. Okay, and that is just one sentence by itself with a period at the end. So Nick gave some chips to Bob, period. That is an independent clause. It's a simple sentence. A compound sentence is an independent clause. Wow, I did not spell it right. Independent clause, comma, and then a fanboys conjunction. And then another independent clause. And I'm going to shorten it. Okay, so let's color code these. You know how much I love to color code. So our independent clauses are going to be in yellow. And our other independent clause is yellow. And then our conjunction is going to be orange. Oh, this is not orange, this is green. Okay, so our compound sentence, we've got Nick gave some chips to Bob. And then we need a comma. But there's our fanboys conjunction. Bob was still hungry. Okay, so this, Bob was still hungry, is an independent clause. It can stand by its own. Put a period at the end, it's a complete thought. Nick gives him chips to Bob. It is an independent clause. Put a period at the end, it's a complete thought. We're going to combine the two to show a relationship. We're going to stick a fanboys conjunction in there and a comma. You may not, ever, 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 never stick two independent clauses together with a comma. That is called a comma splice or a fused sentence, and it is wrong. Okay. Or we can have an independent clause and then a semicolon, and then another independent clause. So what goes on either side of a semicolon? Independent clauses. So again, we've got our yellow to show independent clauses. You can use whatever colors you have. If you don't have any colors, you can do some kind of pattern to show the different things. Okay, so we've got the same independent clauses, and instead of a comma, we can put a semicolon there. So Nick gave some chips to Bob. Bob was still hungry. That does not show a relationship quite as well as using a comma and a fan voice conjunction does. You would use a semicolon when you have two complete thoughts that you want to link together more closely than just using a comma and a fan voice conjunction. Okay. And then the last type of sentence is a complex sentence. And in a complex sentence, we've got a dependent clause, cannot stand alone, dependent clause, and an independent clause. Okay, independent clause, again, is yellow. Dependent clause is going to be orange. So, we've got our example from earlier. Until she has her first cup of coffee, comma, don't try talking to Miss Roundtree. So this, don't try talking to Miss Roundtree, is an independent clause. The subject is the implied you. You don't try talking to Miss Roundtree. And the verb is try talking. It's a complete thought. Put a period at the end and it's a complete thought. Until she has her first cup of coffee, as we talked about earlier, is not a complete thought. You can also flip them around. And we have the dependent clause come second, just like we talked about earlier. And begin with the independent clause. There is no comma in between. We've got the independent and then the dependent. Don't try talking to Miss Roundtree until she has her first cup of coffee. And that is one long sentence. It's a complete thought. We start with an independent clause. We end with a dependent clause.